favorite for a potential national championship game now appears to be the Sugar Bowl if Alabama can get there and play Miami, which means the bowl affected most in the other direction by that Washington loss would be the Rose Bowl. And joining us now from Ann Arbor is Michigan head coach Gary Moeller, who's already been to 2 straight Rose Bowls in his 2 years since taking over at the Wolverines. And coach, while your team does move up in the poll, its chance for a national championship game in Pasadena appears to move down now. How do you feel about that Washington loss yesterday?
Well, Paul, I think you're going to find a few more of these upsets happening, and the only thing I can try to do with my football team is control my schedule. But Washington is an excellent football team. And we also got to remember that Arizona played Miami of Florida about as well as anybody could, and so they're an excellent football team as well.
Are you concerned about the Washington loss deflating your team at all? Because obviously everyone's been gearing for the Rose Bowl, and assuming you and Washington get there, that's still on course, but now it won't be #1 or #2 Washington waiting.
Well, honestly, it had been great, a dream, I guess, if both teams go in there undefeated. I think it would have made for a great battle. But that, nevertheless, don't think that Washington isn't a fine football team as Miami of Florida is, and I think Michigan is, and there's a lot of good teams. The sad thing about this whole thing, Paul, is every kid and every coach has a pressure to win every single game. There's a lot of good football teams, and there's a lot of other sports that have great teams with only 1 loss or 2 losses, but football, it's a little different.
Well, does the fact that #1 is determined by vote, a very subjective thing from voters, as opposed to a playoff, does that put more pressure on who is #1, and who do you think is #1?
Well, I think 2 things. #1, I think it'd be very difficult to come up with the proper number of teams to go after the national title. I don't think to just pick 2 teams would be fair, and I don't know that it isn't better to argue about it at the end of the season, quite honestly. The other thing I hope that doesn't happen is, and I don't think it's happening at this point, but it's possible, that we get a lot of politics involved in the bowl alliances now, and then you have the Pac-10 and the Big Ten fighting the rest of the world. I think that would be very sad to see. So hopefully everybody's voting with an honest conscience.
Well, whether they are or not, we certainly do have the arguments that you talked about, and we'll have more to talk about with you in just a moment. If you don't mind sitting tight, we'll also take a look at more of the new poll. But first, we're going to get to our surprise of the week. The University of Texas traveling to coach. Since you started your season at Notre Dame with that now infamous 17-17 tie, how fortunate for you was it that it came so early in the season so you didn't really drop down too far in the polls?
Well, I think that's always good, Paul, but you got to realize, too, Notre Dame gets bumped off by Stanford. Stanford's a good football team. That Notre Dame team is a real fine football team, but I think it does help you if your misfortunes come earlier in the year.
I'm sure people in Ann Arbor and South Bend still talking about that 17-17 tie. How do you feel about the possibility of overtime coming to college football so teams like yours don't have to leave the field without a win or a loss?
Well, I think there's some good in that. I don't know how you line it up. I guess you'd have to go like the NFL where you kick the ball off. You know, you have it in colleges where or high schools rather, where they put it on the 10, 20-yard line. But in some ways, I think that'd be good. I don't want the game to go on forever, however.
All right. Well, how about the fact that this year you've been doing outstanding, especially since that tie, but criticism's starting to roll up from those who like to do that because you're playing against a rather weak Big Ten this year. How about the downside of your conference and the fact that you've been able to win games against, shall we say, lesser teams?
Well, I think, Paul, you see that all over the country, and I think you're going to continue to see that. The Big Ten may be down a little bit this year, but you see other conferences that are having problems as well. And what we're faced with today is the fact that we're limiting the schools with scholarships, and therefore they have less participants, and the injury factor is such a major factor today that it takes away from a lot of good teams, and it's going to play more of a role in the future. But I don't worry about who we're playing because I know some of these other people aren't playing the greatest teams in the world. We just got to make sure that Michigan wins, and if we win next week, obviously, against Illinois, we'll assure ourselves a place in the Rose Bowl.
Well, I know coaches don't like to look ahead too far, but you've got Illinois, then Ohio State. Allow us to assume you get to the Rose Bowl. How would you assess your team's shot at a national championship?
Well, I think that's always a possibility. I think Alabama's got a few games to play. Miami, Florida's got to play some games. I think that we just have to play and worry about what we can control. We can't control the outside world. And we will have a tough time with Illinois and Ohio State. And if we're fortunate enough to play Washington, I know that they're a great football team, and I take nothing away from Miami. But I'll tell you one thing, Washington is better than where you're rating them today, and they got to be in the top 5.
Well, we appreciate your time this morning, and we wish you luck heading toward Pasadena. Maybe this will be the year you guys get a win out there.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it very much.